Dreams have long fascinated thoughtful people. Three relatively modern theories that are expressed about dreams suggest ways in which we may affect our dreams or the likelihood of us having dreams. There is the pizza theory that says that if you go to bed on a full stomach, you eat spicy foods before bed, or take certain medications, that it will affect your dreams. There is the Rolodex theory that expounds that everything we experience is recorded by the brain, and when we dream, the brain is just putting together random thoughts and memories. Then there is the worry or the wish and worry theory. It proposes that we dream about things that we are concerned about, the things that are on our mind the most. Other interesting observances about dreams include the idea of recurring dreams, that of one falling in their sleep or one who is swimming upstream. There's also the self-hypnosis, where you can supposedly teach yourself how to dream. Then there's that ever-pressing question: do you dream in color or in black and white? Sigmund Freud explored the topic of dreams in his 1899 book, The Interpretation of Dreams, one of the most well-known books about dreams. Why all this talk about dreams? Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 in the New American Standard Bible reads, God, after He spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom also He made the world. Long ago, God spoke to man many times and in various ways. One way in which God spoke to man then was through dreams. It was James Burton Kaufman who was discussing Jacob's dream found in Genesis chapter 28 when he said, many dreams are not even remembered the next morning, only in rare cases longer than a few days. But this one has haunted the imaginations of men for millenniums of time. The dream which Jacob had that is recorded for us in Genesis chapter 28 was an important point in his life. In fact, it was a turning point in his life. One so important that Jesus Christ Himself made mention of it, referencing it in John chapter 1 and verse 51. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we need to consider Jacob's dream. And considering Jacob's dream, or Jacob's ladder, we need to consider Jacob himself. Before the night of that famous dream, Jacob was a cheat and a rascal. He was known for his schemes and his deceptions. He was the younger twin born to Isaac and Rebekah. Born under the patriarchal system as it was, the oldest son received special blessings, one including the birthright. But this blessing not only gave the firstborn more of his father's inheritance and a greater portion of that inheritance, the oldest son became God's spokesman for the family. Jacob cheated his older twin Esau out of his birthright. But Esau was not innocent in this matter. His worldly and profane ways were noted in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 16 and 17. Oftentimes, Esau's Hittite wives are pointed to as an example of his worldly ways. Genesis chapter 28, verses 8 and 9. But nonetheless, Jacob did take advantage of Esau when his older brother was tired and hungry. He traded a bowl of chili for the birthright. Later on, in a more shameful fashion, Jacob also stole Esau's blessing. He deceived his blind father Isaac by putting on Esau's clothes while Esau was out in the field hunting. And Jacob, along with the help of his mother, tricked Isaac into thinking that one twin was the other, and thus the blessing was given to Jacob rather than to Esau. And so when Esau realized that he had been cheated yet again by his brother, he became so angry that he wanted to put his brother to death. But knowing that his father's death was looming, Esau chose, to wait until the passing of his father to carry out this desire. Jacob then, realizing that his life was in danger, went to his mother, and his mother helped him to create a cover story that he needed to go back to the land of his kinsmen to find a wife of the faith. And although this was true, the reality of the situation was that it was just a cover story for Jacob to run from his brother, to get out of his presence, that he might avoid being put to death. Some 400 to 500 miles this journey would be from Canaan back to Mesopotamia, and so it was that Jacob was running for his life. He was apprehensive and alone. He didn't know if Esau was following in pursuit. He didn't know if or when he might be able to return home to take up that inheritance which he had gained by deceit. As it would turn out, Jacob would not return home ever to see his mother again, though he would eventually return home. Jacob was a deceiver, and he had deceived his father, and he had robbed his brother. Surely, with this upon his conscience, he had a guilty conscience. So he ran. He ran, and in the first night he made it some 50 miles from Beersheba to a certain place. Genesis chapter 28 and verse 11. We find out later that this place where he was at was previously called Luz, and Jacob changed the name of it to Bethel in Genesis 28 and verse 19. But Jacob was starting out on this run when we come to our reading in Genesis chapter 28 and verse number 10. Then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head and lay down in that place. As we begin to read this story, we need to first note the ladder. It's found in verse number 12 as he begins to tell us of this dream. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder or a stairway was set up on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. With his head pillowed on a rock, Jacob probably received the best night's rest he had ever had. For in this dream he saw a very peaceful scene, a ladder that was resting on the earth and reaching up as far as to the heavens. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. At the top of the ladder, God stood overseeing the process. The angels ascending and descending as they carried out missions on behalf of God. The ladder itself, a sign of the communication which God had set up between Himself and man. It was there from the top of the ladder that God spoke directly to Jacob for the first time. And God repeated to Jacob a promise which He had previously made to Abraham and to Isaac. He said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Jacob received that covenant promise which his father Abraham and father Isaac had received, which included the promised land, numerous posterity, and that God would use them to be a blessing to all nations. Beyond this, and more relevant to Jacob's immediate situation, was the next promise. It's found in verse 15. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Jacob did not deserve anything, but God promised him everything. We know this to be grace. When we receive something from God that we do not deserve, it is because of God's grace. Overwhelmed by the Lord and His grace, and the fact that He would come to meet Jacob and promise him such blessings in the land of his wanderings, Jacob awoke from his sleep to say, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Genesis 28, verses 16 and 17. Jacob arose from his rest in this certain place to worship God. And he took the stone which was his pillow for the night, and he set it up as a pillar, pouring oil on its top, verse 18. And in fact, this was done to designate the place as a holy place, separate and set apart for God. The stone, now a memorial, was set apart for God from all other stones in the area. In ancient Near Eastern times, oftentimes a change of name signified an important event. And so Jacob changed the name of the place where he rested that night to Bethel, meaning the house of God or God's house. Then Jacob made a vow. Verses 20 to 22. Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This stone, which I have set up as a pillar, will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Understanding that Jacob struggled when it came to trusting God, and the fact that he was a deceiver and this lifestyle would not easily be shaken off, we can understand his petition. Jacob's vow involved 3 petitions, in fact. One petition was that God's protective presence be with him as he made his journey. 2, that God's divine provisions be granted to him. And a 3rd was for a safe return home. That 3rd petition might be seen as the result of the first 2 preconditions. For if God's protective presence was with Jacob on his journey, and God provided for him those divine provisions that were needed for the trip, one might say the end result would be a safe return home. But based upon these preconditions, Jacob promised devotion to God. He promised dedication of the site where he slept to God. And he made an offering of a tithe, that all that God would give him, Jacob would return to God a tenth of it. That's the story. That's the story, but the question for you and I today is, what are the lessons for us? There is a lesson here about God's providence. God's providence. The ladder which God set up was kept up between heaven and earth. God has established and maintained lines of communication between Himself and His creation. In fact, even now, though unseen, angels render services for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse number 14. Jacob needed God's providential care, and God took the initiative to inform him of such. And God has done the same for you and I today. God has presented us with His Word, instructing us and telling us of our need for Him in our lives. The question is, will we listen? It took Jacob being flat of his back in a certain place in his wanderings for Jacob to begin to listen to God. But then Jacob realized that he was in the presence of God, and he described the place as the gate of heaven. Genesis 28 and verse 17. The New Testament tells us, instructs us as Christians to come boldly before the throne of grace. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16, in order to receive mercy and to find grace to help in time of need. We, much like Jacob, are in need of God's providence. God's providential care is offered to us if we will but obey Him, coming boldly before His throne of grace. There is also a lesson here about God's omnipresence. Jacob was away from home, in a strange land, fleeing from a vengeful brother, but one cannot flee beyond the watchful eye of the Lord. Jacob awoke to this conclusion: surely the Lord is in this place. In fact, God is everywhere. He is not far from each one of us. Acts chapter 17 and verse 27. It is not God's distance from us that keeps us from experiencing His presence, but rather our distance from Him through the blinding effects of sin. Today you may feel as though God is not near. God is just as near to you as He has ever been, but the effects of sin cause us to perceive that God is far from us. God's promise to Jacob, I will not leave you, has a New Testament equivalent when Jesus said in Matthew 28 and verse 20, Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. We need to follow the instruction of James 4 and verse 8. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Finally, there is a lesson here about God's mercy. This lesson was possibly the most important lesson of the three, even though Jacob knew next to nothing about it at the time. In fact, the blessing promise, the promise that all peoples of the earth would be blessed through Jacob and through his offspring, demonstrated God's mercy towards all people of the earth, not just Jacob. But this promise is still being fulfilled. It's still being fulfilled even today. Read with me John chapter 1, beginning in verse number 49. John chapter 1, verse 49, Nathanael said, or answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus answered and said to him, Because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Did you catch that? Jesus is the ladder between heaven and earth. Jesus is both the Son of Man and the Son of God. In His human nature, He is set upon the earth. In His divine nature, He is reaching to heaven. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16. He is our spiritual ladder, the means by which we may climb and ascend into heaven. John chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. God's mercy has provided for us a clear path to Him, and it is through His Son. Therefore, Frank L. Cox wrote, "By Him, the lowliest of sinners on the earth may ascend to the Father's kingdom." It is through Jesus Christ that we understand God's mercy, and we can ascend into heaven. We can ascend to the very throne room of God. We can ascend into heaven itself to dwell with our Father through Jesus Christ. Now, Jacob did not walk up the ladder physically, even in his dream, but it took him to a higher level. His understanding of these things took him to a level at which he would leave the old behind and become in that day a man of faith, a man of prayer, and a man of obedience. God has established a means of communication with you and I today. Acts chapter 10 and verse 36. This communication comes through His Son, Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2, and it has been written down, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. In this written communication that God has given to us, we have been given the opportunity to leave our past behind and to restore our relationship with God. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. In order for us to restore this relationship between He and us, God sent forth His Son, John chapter 3 and verse 16, to die for us, showing us His love, Romans chapter 5 and verse 8. He has also made many promises to those who will obey Him. He has promised the forgiveness of sins, Acts 2 and verse 38. He has promised to adopt us as children of His, 1 John chapter 3 verses 1 and 2. He has promised us access to His throne, Romans 5 verses 1 and 2. And He has promised to allow fellowship to exist between He and us and all those who obey Him, 1 John chapter 1 and verse 3. Other promises of God are given, Galatians 3 and verse 22, which include eternal salvation, 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 9, laying claim to a crown of life which we will receive following death, Revelation 2 and verse 10. But how do we receive these promises? We must enter into a covenant relationship with God. We enter a covenant with God by hearing His Word, Romans 10 and verse 17, believing in Him and His Son, Hebrews 11 and verse 6, and responding through faith to His offer by repenting of our sins, Acts 3 and verse 19, confessing belief in Christ as the Son of God, Acts 8 and verse 37, and being baptized for the promised remission of sins, Acts 2 and verse 38. To stay true then to the covenant and to remain in a relationship with God, we must live righteous lives, Titus chapter 2 verses 11 through 14. When Jacob, there in that certain place, considered God's promises, he vowed devotion, dedication, and sacrifice as part of his obedience. Today we invite you and ask you to consider the promises God has made to each one of us concerning our sins, the forgiveness of those sins, a relationship with Him, and ultimately that prized possession of ascending the ladder into heaven to dwell with Him for eternity. What do God's promises mean to you? When you consider God's promises, they beg a response from each one of us. This morning, the invitation song has been selected. And as we sing this invitation hymn, it's to encourage you to consider the promises that God has made. Consider what God has done for you through His Son, Jesus Christ. And considering those things to give you a convenient opportunity to respond to the Lord's invitation that is always open. So this morning, we invite you to do just that. Consider the promises. Consider the Lord's calling you to respond. And respond as you will as we stand and as we sing.